Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Your book, Tibet, An Unfinished Story, is, I think, one of the few books I've seen that has received very strong reviews, both from academia as well as people in government circles. So can you tell us briefly the theme of the book?
The book looks at two different Tibets, and in one dimension we look at Tibet, a small, naive government in Lhasa searching for their independence, who looks to the United States, who looks to India, and then looks to Britain for help. But instead they encounter this perfect storm because on one side they have the United States, who were mired in their own problems, domestic and politically abroad. They were fighting communism, and then they looked to the Lhasa government they looked to India, and then there was Nehru, who had just come into power, and he believed that his security required that he was really more interested in what the Chinese were doing and didn't want to have a war. And then finally Britain, whose financial straits were severely limited at the time. So the Tibetans found and really did encountered a perfect storm, and that's the one dimension that we look at in the book. And in the other dimension, we look at the myth of Tibet, and this is the imagined kingdom that everybody sort of knows, this Shangri-La. And we look at how the myth has impacted Tibet today, why it's still so strong, and also how this myth is impacting China in terms what we believe is that this is Tibet's soft power.
I see. Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself and your co-author, husband, Stefan Harper, and why you guys chose to do this book?
My co-author is Stefan Halper, and in the late 90s we were invited by the Chinese government to China, and we asked for permission to go into Tibet, and we were given that to go into Lhasa and some of the surrounding areas we got permission for almost a week and a half. And it was the 90s, so there was a bit more freedom, but of course we had two minders with us. We were taken to at the time, I think there was only one hotel, the Lhasa Holiday Inn, and we were put in this hotel, and there was a minder outside the door, and the minder said to us, "You stay in that hotel, and if you want to see Lhasa, we'll go with you." Well, we promptly, at around 5 in the morning, snuck out the door. The minder was there sleeping, and we saw down at the Jokhang Temple just the beauty, the quietness, and then as the sun came up we saw the Himalayas, and we were just enamored with the absolute beauty of the whole region. And then on the other side, sort of this juxtaposition of what we saw was happening there. There would be monks that would come up to us surreptitiously handing us notes, asking for help. Could they talk to us? And we knew at the time that the Chinese were systematically deconstructing the Tibetan culture. So when we got back to the United States, we began to write about this. And then we ended up in Cambridge, where my husband teaches, and I began a master's and then later a PhD in the area of Tibetan studies, and have just followed through now with this book.
I see. Interesting. Just to step back a little, you mentioned that Tibet had been surrounded by myths, some going back many, many centuries. Just tell us a couple of them for our audience.
Sure. We start in the book with the 5th century with the idea of Herodotus talking about, a Greek scholar talking about gold-digging ants. And you see this image of gold-digging ants reappear over the centuries. We go up to the 12th century when there were Christian missionaries in Tibet. They talked of finding women in Tibet with teeth as long as boar's tusks, and this free-flowing wine and food, and this mystical idea. And then you go up through the centuries until the British come in, the 1700s, and then finally to 1904 when Colonel Younghusband opens up Lhasa. And then the images that are coming out of Tibet are British creations, and the world is finally, this was the blank space on the map. Tibet was the blank space, Lhasa was the blank space, and they're filling in this, and we're getting images of, again, happy people, this idea of mysticism. And then, of course, James Hilton in 1933 writes his, Lost Horizon. And then the rest of the world really sees, really knows about Tibet.
And how do you think all of this, leading up to the British encounter with Tibet, etc., how do you think they've impacted how the world viewed Tibet as a real place, as a country, do you think, in the 20th century?
Well, I think that initially the myth part of this has been in some way a bit of a detriment, because when people talk about Tibet, the first thing they're going to ask you is, they're going to ask you about these stories, about Shangri-La. Is it really true? James Hilton wrote that this was a place where you weren't going to age. And everybody wants to believe that there's some utopia, some place out there where you're going to go, you're not going to age, you're going to be happy, you're going to read books. So in a way, I have felt that perhaps that has hampered Tibet in its growth. But now we're overcoming that. And in fact, as we say, the Tibetans have this power with the myth. They have the power of moral condemnation. Every time a Tibetan story comes out in the newspaper, it's above the crease in the Washington Post or the New York Times, because the Chinese are violating human rights, or the Chinese are forcing something on the Tibetans. And so this is their soft power, this myth, and they can use it effectively in the world.
We get a little bit into the meat of your book, if I may. Right in the middle of World War II, President Roosevelt sent two emissaries to Lhasa. They brought gifts and greetings to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I think it's fair to say that the Tibetan government in Lhasa assumed, let's say, that this was perhaps the beginning of a new diplomatic relations with the U.S. This was not to be. Why do you think that was?
First of all, the period you're talking about is 1942. The Burma Road had been closed, and the United States was looking for, perhaps another way to get the goods in. And so they sent two OSS agents, Brooke Dolan and Ilya Tolstoy, into Tibet. They finally got permission. There was still and this was our first official covert foray into Tibet, and there was still in the government, starting in 1942, this idea of whether Tibet was sovereign or whether there was a suzerainty, whether they were under control of China. Even though since 1911 the Tibetans had been, of course, managing their own domestic affairs. But you can see that while Roosevelt did give gifts and did send those along with the men, he wrote to the Dalai Lama in his capacity as a religious leader, and making very clear that he did not address the Dalai Lama as a leader of the Tibetan nation. So you can see there, this is sort of the beginning of this debate of what is the status of Tibet. And indeed, the relations from there didn't really open up anything in Tibet vis-a-vis the United States, but clearly the Americans were able to get a good feel for the Tibetan people, their culture, their welcoming nature. And so I think it was good for the next administration, the Truman administration, where they really began to look at Tibet policy.
I see. Interesting. Following World War II, with the Soviet expansion, Soviet influence expansion, spread of communism, growing strength of the communists in the Chinese Civil War, in which the U.S. supported the Kuomintang. Forces came into play in the U.S., especially here in Washington, that worked against the interests of Tibet seeking recognition of its sovereignty. What were some of the forces? What was the dynamics here in Washington?
Fabulously interesting period. So let's begin in 1948, July. The Tibetans sent their first delegation over, and it was a trade delegation. They were asking to back their currency here. But they were also trying to flex their muscles to show that they were an independent nation. But what happened was, of course, the nationalists, the KMT, were in power, Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek, like the communists today, believed that Tibet was a part of China. So this was a real problem. The nationalists here, the China Lobby, which were a group of businessmen and wealthy entrepreneurs. Henry Luce, who was the head of Time Life and Fortune magazine, reached 1/4 of the reading public every week. they all pushed, they were all supporting Chiang Kai-shek, and it made it very difficult for the United States to go against this, because after this you had the Red Scare. The China lobby led to the McCarthy period. And no one was willing to sort of acknowledge that the Tibetans perhaps could be an independent nation. We had a legal advisor in the State Department looking over all the important documentation. And while he said yes, in fact, the Tibetans could, in theory, have an independent country, the forces of, say, the Red Scare, the China lobby, all of that came into play.
And also there was a Christian lobby. How did that
Yeah, this
work
was
in
the
this
Catholic
dynamic?
Church that fed into this idea of supporting Chiang Kai-shek, because this was all against communism. This idea of godless communism against we have a religion. And it wasn't necessarily that this was Catholic or Jewish. It was more just a general religiosity that we saw during this period. But of course, Chiang Kai-shek fled in 1949 as the communists took over. And I like to think that in this period, say from the end of 1948 until the Korean War, perhaps the United States could have done more for the Tibetans. But again, President Truman and Secretary of State Dean Acheson were just mired in many difficulties. Think that the communists had just signed an agreement with Moscow, February 14th, 1950, the Sino-Soviet Treaty. The Americans were very, very concerned about communism, and Tibet was sort of pushed down to the lower rungs on the ladder. Having said that, around March, April 1950, Dean Acheson decided that they would quietly strengthen, those were the words, quietly strengthen the Tibetan Secretary of State, decided that he would quietly strengthen the Tibetan military if the Tibetans were going to resist communism. And that sort of led into, then we had the Korean War, and then after the Korean War in June of 1950, the United States began talks with their ambassador in India, which was Ambassador Henderson, about really trying to help the Tibetans. If the Tibetans were going to resist, the United States would be able to provide some sort of military, some sort of aid.
And all of this was swirling around the diplomatic relations and communications between the United States, India, and the changes happening in China, as well as Britain. Now, Britain is one of the few great powers, let's say at the time, that had a more profound relation with Tibet, going back to the Simla Accord of 1914, which to this day delineates the border between the People's Republic of China and India. But there's an absence in your book on Britain's part, and I think they didn't really step forward on behalf of Tibet, or also as a step against the spread of communism. Why is that?
In one word, the British were broke. I mean, but we'll unpack that. It was a difficult time for Britain. They had given the rights and obligations in 1947 to India, and we haven't really discussed Nehru because he really is part of this equation. And so they were divesting of their interests in various places, and they were looking to themselves. They were trying to build up their own infrastructure. And so when this idea of Tibet, should we help the Tibetans, they really felt that now India could take the lead. And Nehru made it clear to the British, to Whitehall. Delhi made it clear to Whitehall that they did not want them involved. Look, this is now Tibet's our problem, or we are going to deal with it. And Whitehall was very happy to sort of say, okay, that's fine. Having said all that, the British did pass the messages that they received through India to the Americans. And so much of the documentation, some of the documentation in the book is really through their contacts in India that the Americans received. All top secret type of information.
To follow up on that, both the United States and, as you said, Britain had essentially divested their interests in Tibet to the newly independent India. And the United States seems to have been looking to India, because of its geostrategic position perhaps, to take a lead in taking a stand for Tibet. But Nehru didn't come through on that. Prime Minister Nehru didn't come through on that, neither in raising the issue of Tibet at the UN or in its diplomatic dealings with China and the United States. Why do you think that is?
There are so many facets to this issue, and some of them were personal with the Indian Prime Minister. But the one that stands out most is that when Nehru came to be the Prime Minister, he right away told the world that his politics were going to be neutral. By the mid-50s, we know that as non-alignment. And so when he was not going to take a broad, encompassing stand on really anything. He wanted to be neutral. So the United States found that very difficult. Particularly John Foster Dulles, who was a strong anti-communist, could not understand. I think in one of his speeches he said, neutralism or non-alignment, this is immoral. I mean, they just, they could not understand why Nehru would not, help them in their fight against the Chinese communists. Well, of course, as I said in the beginning, Nehru shared a border with China, 2,000 miles. He didn't have the army like the Chinese did. He didn't have the infrastructure. He didn't need a war. And of course, he didn't do anything about his boundaries, which are why we have boundary issues today. But more than that, it was very difficult for the Americans to understand Prime Minister Nehru. He came in October 1949 for a visit, and it was a disaster. To the United States, sorry, and it was just a disaster. The Americans tried to break through. They feted him, which gave him big dinners, which Nehru wrote in his biography or autobiography that these were ostentatious and gross, and he found the Americans not to understand the Indians at all. And Dean Acheson, in one event, the Secretary of State took him home for a private dinner and just could not get through to him, and at 1 in the morning said, I cannot do this anymore. And he wrote this in his memoirs, I just cannot get through to this man. So there was no open way for the Americans to talk to the Indians because the channel had been so blocked. And so when the United States wanted to help the Tibetans, they would have had to have gone through India overtly, and that wasn't possible. It is why, in the end, they opted for covert operations.
Do you think during that period, leading all the way up through the 50s to the final assault by the PLA on Tibet, do you think Prime Minister Nehru was receiving or understanding the situation in Tibet vis-a-vis China's intentions, or receiving correct information from his ambassador in Beijing and in assessing the whole situation?
No, I don't. And in our book, there's concrete evidence to show the readers that Panikkar, that was K.M. Panikkar, who was the ambassador, he was very pro-Chinese, pro-communist. And one example that I'd like to say is when the Chinese invaded Tibet in October of 1950, both Prime Minister Nehru and Mao were all very shocked at one another's reaction, and especially Prime Minister Nehru. He said, how could this happen? I had no idea. I was granted access into the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and I have documents that show clearly that Panikkar was told in meetings beginning in August 3 or 4 different times that Tibet would be liberated and that the troops were amassing at the border. Of course, the Chinese could not have gone into Tibet just like that. They had to have amassed at the border. Someone would have had to have seen this. So Panikkar was really not giving the correct information to Nehru. And unfortunately, he was all that the Americans had as well. He was giving the information about North Korea, what was happening there, to the United States. And so I don't think that all the information, the United States called him Panicky Panikkar. And there were another few different names for him because they just thought he was unreliable.
Going back to 1950, with the first PLA assault on eastern Tibet, the Dalai Lama had moved from Lhasa to Yatung, close to the Indian border. during that period, and even after His Holiness returned to Lhasa, U.S. Ambassador Henderson had written notes, letters that seemed to offer strong support, was asking for the Lhasa government to repudiate the 17-point agreement, and was using words such as freedom, etc., but which I think, do you think those notes and letters had the backing of the U.S. government in terms of actually following through to supporting Tibet in a much more profound manner? Or were they part of the U.S. policy at the time to just create further pain and obstacles for the communists in China?
I think there's two sides to that story. First of all, Ambassador Henderson initially wrote those letters of his own, on his own, but then he contacted the State Department, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and he did have the backing of the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of the State, Dean Acheson, and President Truman were very close. This was not one of these presidencies like, say, Roosevelt and Truman, where Truman was uninformed about what was going on. They were close, so I would gather that Truman knew what was going on, and they supported what Ambassador Henderson was saying to the Tibetans. Look, you know, get some sort of resistance going here. We are going to help you. We're going to offer the Dalai Lama asylum. We would prefer to do it in another country first, a Buddhist country, but if that doesn't work, we will arrange it. And I do believe that this would have happened, but of course the Dalai Lama went back to Tibet. On the other hand, there is an element that nations don't really have friends. They have interests. And Tibet was going to be, the Tibetans would be a great way to try to harass and needle, and these are quotes from Dean Acheson's memoirs, the communists. And so it's a double-edged sword. But I have read in the personal notes of Ambassador Henderson, and he really did have the feeling and the empathy for the Tibetans. He was out there, he knew what was going on. So I think if events had changed and perhaps the Dalai Lama had stayed out, I do believe the Americans would have helped them.
Interesting. Finally, the title of your book, intriguing, very intriguing to many, Tibet, an Unfinished Story. What is that?
Well, we are hoping that it's an unfinished story in terms of that there's another chapter to it. We're hoping that the Tibetans perhaps use their soft power, use it, as I said, as the moral condemnation to get China to change. Look, China wants to be a player. You know, they want to come to the table, to the negotiating table. They want to be a first world power. Yet this idea of human rights and what they're doing in Tibet, the Tibetans don't get to practice their religion. They cannot have a picture of the Dalai Lama. They can't leave. Their passports have been confiscated. They can't walk down the street. The Chinese are worried about now self-immolations. Self-immolation is an act of desperation. This shows you that the Tibetan people, their culture's under pressure. What would it take? Why won't the Chinese just let up a bit and then have the world look more favorably upon the Chinese government right now? That's all it would take. Whether it's autonomy, I'm not sure about independence, but clearly let the Tibetan people practice their religion and let them look after their domestic affairs. Now, whether or not that's going to happen, I don't know, but that's why it's an unfinished story for us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.